Hi class, today we're going to review chapters 1 through 17 from the Story of the World, specifically focusing on Mesopotamia and Egypt. I'm going to be going fairly quickly and not explaining things a lot because these are things we've already covered and things we've reviewed, and so this video is to just solidify it more into your minds. So we're going to start with Mesopotamia, and we are going to start with the Sumerians and end with the Babylonians. For Egypt, we will study Narmer to the Third Intermediate Period. So let's start with Mesopotamia, from the Sumerians to the Babylonians. Here is a timeline for you, so you kind of get a visual of just the whole stretch of what we've covered. You can kind of see how long the Sumerian civilization lasted. It was here before 3000, but that's where we started, so that's where I started the timeline. You can see how short the Neo-Babylonian Empire was. You can see how long Assyria lasted. You can see that time period where Babylon doesn't have a time period because they were controlled and ruled by the Assyrians. Now, they did have brief moments of independence, but we didn't cover that, so that's why it's left blank. Okay, so let's begin with the Sumerian civilization. So Sumerian civilization begins with the beginning of civilization, whenever that was, 223-34 BC. This is the beginning of kingship, of cities, of streaming in, where you have country dwellers moving in mass numbers to the cities and drastically changing their way of life. And this was occurring in mass numbers around 3200 BC. You have the beginning of aristocracy, where you have a class of people born to rule and creating a hierarchy within the city. Writing is developed around 3000, and this also revolutionizes how people communicate with each other, what they can do in terms of trade, and then also it changes how people can pass down stories and knowledge into the future. Gilgamesh ruled in the Sumerian civilization around 2700 BC, and a little while later he becomes legendary and his story is written down, and it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this is the oldest piece of literature that we have. The Sumerians were conquered by the Akkadian Empire in 2334 BC, which lasted to 2100 BC. It was conquered by Sargon, who was a cupbearer to the king of Kish, betrays the king, takes over all of Mesopotamia. He rules this region using military dictatorship. He stations soldiers in each of the cities to ensure that the cities don't rebel. The Sumerians, who speak a different language, are living like foreigners in their own land at this point. He does something that I think is really cool, and he standardizes weights and measures across the region, making trade easier. The Akkadian Empire is the time where you do have the Gutian invasion. The Gutians were considered barbarians by the Akkadians and the Sumerians because they did not have their own writing or their own culture or their own sculptures or buildings or things like that. They come in and they destroy culture, and they don't replace it with one of their own. So the Akkadian Empire is greatly weakened by the Gutian invasion. And this is when the Sumerians say, hey, now's our chance. And in 2112 BC, you have the beginning of the Neo-Sumerian dynasty, where you have kings like Ur-Nammu kicking out the Gutians and gaining power over the Akkadians. However, even though they were strong for a brief period and they were able to conquer that whole region, they had some environmental issues going on, like salinization, where there was too much salt in their fields and therefore the crops wouldn't grow, which leads to famine, which leads to not having enough money to pay an army. So now you don't have protection, and that's when the Amorites invaded and start taking their land. The Elamites, who are living on the other side of the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, see this as an opportunity. Sumerians and Elamites have been bickering and battling for a very long time, and the Elamites come and invade Sumer. This is the fall of the Sumerian civilization to Elam in 2004 BC. This leads to a period that's called the IcinLarsa period. Different historians date and name things differently, but this is the one we're going with. But it lasts from about 2004 to 1792 BC. This period is messy. You have different people vying for power and fighting, specifically Icin, Larsa, and Elam. This is when Assyria and Babylon emerge as powers. So the old Babylonian Empire begins in 1792 with Hammurabi, and it lasts until 1595. Now Hammurabi was a very powerful king, and he conquers all of Mesopotamia, and he's the one who writes down these laws for people to follow, and it's called the Code of Hammurabi because he believed people should follow him and follow these laws because it's the right thing to do, not because they're forced to do it, very unlike Sargon. So he makes Assyria a vassal for a short time. However, Hammurabi dies and the Babylonian Empire is very weak after him, and so it shrinks and it shrinks and it keeps shrinking, and during this time the Hittites are growing and gaining power in the Asia Minor. The old Assyrian Empire, people say it starts in 1900 because that's when the city of Assur is founded. However, the Assyrian Empire, so one city ruling over multiple cities, doesn't start until 1813 with Shamshi-Adad, and it lasts until 1393. Now, the old Assyrian Empire isn't very strong because first it's ruled by Babylon, then it's independent and it's peaceful for a while. However, it's not strong enough to branch out and to conquer other cities. During this time, the Mitanni rise to power, and Assyria becomes a Mitanni vassal from 1450 to 1393 BC. And this leads us to Kassite Babylonia and Middle Assyria. So Kassite, or Middle Babylonian Empire, goes from 1595 to 1155. So the Hittites, who were growing in power, were like, we want to show the world how powerful we are, and they go and they destroy Babylon. Babylon is so weak it can't do anything. But the Hittites are too far away to rule Babylon, so they're like, prove my point. They go home, and wandering nomads called the Kassites come and they take over Babylon. So this is called Kassite Babylonia, and they rule for about 400 years. Now, Middle Assyria is a little bit different, and again, these dates don't line up correctly, so pay attention to those dates. But 1393 to 934, they are able to defeat the Mitanni and take their land. So they're no longer under their rule. So now they're independent. Then they grow because they take their land. Then they battle the Hittites and weaken them. They're in constant conflict with the Babylonians, and for the most part, they're able to rule over them. The Middle Assyria is when they begin the practice of deportation, where when they conquer a people group, they take that people group and they put them in a different part of their kingdom. There is 100 years or so of decline and shrinking that happens during the Bronze Age collapse, which we talked about briefly when we talked about Assyria, and we will cover again when we talk about the Mycenaeans in Greek. So then that leads us to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So it goes from 934 to 609 BC. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is the most famous. It is where the Assyrians are very cruel, and they're just so good at warfare that nobody can stop them. They expand to their greatest extent. They conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. They conquer Egypt, and some of the famous kings during this time are Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, who was very cruel, but he also builds a library. Eventually, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is destroyed by the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Persians, who unite and destroy Nineveh. So this is when Babylon emerges as a world power for a short time. The Babylonian Empire lasts from 626 to 539 BC. Nebuchadnezzar II is the strongest king. He conquers Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, and brings the people of Israel into exile. And this is where the book of Daniel is set. He is also famous for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And that's the end of our review of Mesopotamia. However, I put all of that information onto one slide for you so you can just kind of see how it all played out. I just love having a visual and love being able to see, oh, this is happening when this is happening. So just take a moment and look at this and just kind of get that visual in your head. Okay, so moving on to Egypt from Narmer to the Third Intermediate Period. So here is a table of the different kingdoms and intermediate periods with the corresponding dynasties, the dates, and the length of each of the kingdoms or the intermediate periods. We're going to start with early dynastic, dynasties 1 to 2. It went from 3100 to 2696 BC. It begins when Narmer unites Egypt around 3100. We don't know a ton about this time period, but we know that Egypt's government and the economy grew. The pharaohs were viewed as gods. Egypt is a polytheistic society. They worship a pantheon of gods. The Old Kingdom of Egypt goes from dynasties 3 to 6, and it lasts from 2696 to 2181 BC. This is a time of pyramid building, which means they are very prosperous, very rich, under very powerful rulers. They're able to have these huge labor forces working for these monuments that will become their graves. Some of the famous pharaohs during the Old Kingdom are Djoser, Khufu, and Snefru. And however, the Old Kingdom of Egypt declines towards the end because they're wasting money and lives on pyramid building. We've talked about how you're not adding into the economy a ton by building these things, in the sense of you're not growing food or you're not building houses for people to live in. A lot of intermarriage in the royal family, who believed they could only marry each other because they were deity and other people were not. All this intermarriage may have caused some genetic issues and sicknesses. And then also drought occurred, the Nile floods started decreasing, and so Egypt just entered into a time of decline. And that time of decline is called the First Intermediate Period, which lasts from dynasty 7 to 10, from the years 2181 to 2040 BC. Many insignificant pharaohs are ruling during this time. They're fighting for power. Different dynasties are ruling at the same time. I think 9 and 10 are ruling at the same time, things like that. Government officials called nomarchs are also gaining a lot of power because there's no powerful pharaoh on the throne. Mentuhotep II finally reunites Egypt after almost 150 years of Egypt not having one strong ruler over them. That leads to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, dynasties 11 to 12, and this goes from 2040 to 1782 BC. And just as a side note, Hammurabi conquers conquers Mesopotamia and becomes the king of the Babylonian Empire in 1792. So the Middle Kingdom ends around the time Hammurabi does that, just to kind of give you a frame of reference when things are happening at the same time. So once again, Egypt is united, it's prosperous like the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The Middle Kingdom is characterized by a flourishing of art and literature. So art and literature, specifically writing, is no longer seen as these things that people do in order to glorify a pharaoh or to write down the things that he did, but art and literature are now being used to write down the experiences of common people and depict everyday things like nature. Construction on the Karnak temple complex begins, and again, this construction extends into the New Kingdom. Egypt expands into Nubia, builds a lot of military fortresses there, and some of the famous pharaohs that we've studied are Amenemhet I and Senusret III. However, Egypt again falls into an intermediate period which lasts from dynasties 13 to 17, from the year 1782 to 1570. So during this time, Egypt is weak, it's divided. You have 13th and 14th dynasties ruling at the same time, and you have the Hyksos, who are Western Semitic people, probably living in Egypt, come and they defeat the 13th and 14th dynasty, and they begin the 15th dynasty. They allow the 16th and 17th to rule alongside them, even though they are pretty weak. Almost finally drives out the Hyksos out of Egypt. And that begins the new kingdom of Egypt from dynasties 18 to 20, and this lasts from 1570 to 1070, so 500 years. The pharaohs are buried in the Valley of Kings. Egypt becomes an empire. It expands to twice its size. And so the New Kingdom is a time when, if you think about Egypt, you're probably thinking about the New Kingdom of Egypt. It's the most famous time in Egyptian history. So some of the famous pharaohs that we studied are Hatshepsut, Tutmosis III, King Tut, and his tomb, and Ramses II. And we looked at the Battle of Kadesh, where he fights with the Hittites, and the first international peace treaty was signed. And then Egypt falls into the third intermediate period, and it goes from 1070 to 664 BC. And I believe it goes from dynasties 21 to 26. Sorry, that's not on the slide. The priests of Amun are able to take power, and part of this is because they have a lot of land and a lot of money, but also because of this worldview shift that happens in how people view the pharaoh and view Amun and things like that. Egypt is split. It's ruled by the priests and it's ruled by the pharaoh, and they're weak because of this, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire is able to attack and control Egypt for a while. So Esarhaddon does that, and Ashurbanipal also attacks as well. They eventually are invaded and controlled by the Persians, and then, except for brief periods, Egypt would not gain full independence until 1936 AD, so less than 100 years ago. So that is the end of our review. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.